Welcome to the Oak Tree Institute podcast, the podcast designed to serve nonprofit and community leaders. In this episode of the Oak Tree Institute podcast, we welcome our guest, Mohammed Almathil. He is a leadership expert and has held leadership positions and executive roles for various community centers and national organizations. He has had a passion for leadership and organizational development and graduated with a master's degree in human resource management from New York University. He's been a leadership and management trainer for many years and has worked with people within various organizations across different industries and has served thousands of people. He has done local and national trainings around leadership and human resource development and strategic planning. And he was the former executive director of Oak Tree Institute. We're very excited to host him on today's episode. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullah. Welcome everybody back to the Oak Tree Institute podcast. I am very, very excited and honored to be hosting a very dear friend, a colleague, a mentor, a teacher, and someone that I've learned so much from for so many years. My dear brother, Mohammed Almathil, former executive director of Oak Tree Institute. Welcome, Akhi Mohammed.
Hey, Akhi Rami, welcome as well to you. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure being with you, and I look forward to our conversation.
Allah Akbar, man. I really appreciate you being on, and very excited actually to have you on. I think you're, of course, I've known you for many years, and I know that your expertise in a lot of the things that we're going to be discussing today, subhanAllah, the first podcast of 2021, the first podcast I think that will be really focusing on giving leaders and nonprofit organizations in our community really important tips for them to know to focus on in 2021. So I'm really excited for that conversation. But before we get there, I've known you for a long time. I don't think maybe a lot of our listeners have, though. You've been so instrumental and done so much nonprofit work and community work for such a long time. You've been in so many different leadership positions, and I was honored to be under your leadership for a couple of years. So I wanted to, kind of dig in with you, Mohammed, on your personal story, right? Well, what led to you being where you are today? Tell us a little bit about that story, if you don't mind.
Okay, great. Jazakallah khair, Akhi Rami. And once again, it's an honor to be here with you. And I hope that our conversation will be productive and beneficial, especially as a starting point for 2021 for all of your listeners. I don't know where to start, to be honest with you, but just to keep it brief, I always had a passion and a natural tendency to lead. And I tell people even now, I know it sounds like an exaggeration, but training and developing leaders for me is like my oxygen. I feel like it's essential for my survival. I know it might sound like an exaggeration, as I said to some people. So from a very young age, I just had that natural tendency as a student, natural tendency to be the student leader, whether it's recognized by other classmates or by teachers or by the principal. I always took initiative to go above and beyond, to try and organize events and so on and so forth. And then another passion of mine was reading. So I constantly invested time and effort in reading earlier on, and then being able to study effective leaders in different industries and sectors and throughout history, and trying to pick up certain lessons and values and strategies from them along the way. And that helped me essentially, as I said, naturally was inclined to lead, helped me improve my behavior, improve my mindset, and more importantly, improve my result on the ground as I applied some of those techniques that I learned through rigorous studying and reading on my own. And basically throughout, whether as a student or even after that, was blessed and honored to take on different leadership initiatives and leadership positions of different organizations, student organizations, nonprofit organizations, and even businesses, and was able, regardless of the sector, regardless of the size of the organization, was able to do what I'm passionate about, and that is to train leaders in different capacities and to be able to help them succeed in different ways by empowering them with skill set to be able to take their execution to a whole new level. That's a simple story. I don't know if it makes a lot of sense, but that's a simple story to try and save the time for your listeners.
I love it. No, Jazakallah khair. I really appreciate you sharing that, Mohammed. And I know your passion for leadership, and so it's amazing when you hear the entire story and you think about the entire journey to where you're at today. I want to, how did you know that it was leadership? So I know, a lot of times I think people, they take on leadership initiatives, they become leaders, they love the organizations that they're a part of, or sometimes corporations or businesses that they're a part of. But why did you try? Well, first of all, why leadership? Why was that your particular passion? If you can tell us that. And then also why did you focus on training leaders? Like, why didn't you just continue to be a leader? And you are, I mean, in some extent, but you started to become more of a trainer, a consultant, a coach, a support system for leaders. Why was also that your area that you wanted to focus on? So why leadership, and why training and consulting and working with leaders?
Sure. Awesome. I mean, at the end of the day, it boils down for me to the impact and the return on investment, right? Yes, currently I still lead a team and I manage a team and various different projects, but for more than a decade, the focus has always been to train other leaders, even through the organizations that I'm a part of. And when we focus on the impact and the return on investment, for me personally, I look at my life as many of us do, as a very short time frame with an expiration date. And therefore, to maximize this very, very limited time and to maximize the amount of impact from this very limited time with the highest return on investment, when I thought about it, when I studied it, when I read about it, when I, sat down with experts, at the end, it boiled down to trying to not just double, not just triple, not just, 10x the impact, but even way beyond that when I invest in leaders, as opposed to just simply managing a group of people or leading an organization, right? It's almost like a mathematical equation, right? If I manage an organization, and let's assume I have, 10 employees under my direct supervision, and they each have 10 under them, right? And then we serve, let's assume, 1,000 stakeholders through our services or products that we offer. At the end of the day, that's more or less 1,100 people, more or less, right? But when I focus, and again, capitalizing on the very limited time that we have, and focus on increasing that impact, the only way to do that, for me at least, is to actually develop other leaders. So I'm not just focused on, I have 10 people that I lead directly, I have an organization and we serve 1,100 people on a regular basis. Rather, can I look at the top Fortune 500 companies, and then can I look at 300 to 500 different organizations and actually train their leaders? And they take that further by training their direct subordinates, or the people that work directly under them, and then the stakeholders that they serve, and so on and so forth. So it's almost, as I said, a mathematical equation to maximize the limited time that I have, to maximize the impact and the highest return of investment from that time. Because again, it's not just duplicating or doubling the impact. I mean, in this case, it can 10x or beyond that when we focus on equipping leaders with the right attitudes, with the right skill sets, with the right behaviors to be able to impact other human beings as well.
I love it. And that, I mean, the idea of really focusing on what gets you the most value. I love that concept, that a lot of times And it happens often to many people, particularly leaders, where we're focused on things that are not the priority. Whereas, and I think, and I definitely agree with you that when you invest in leaders, that's a magnifying effect to the impact you can make. And obviously, as we both know, right, leaders are so vital to the success of any organization, particularly, of course, not nonprofit organizations in our community. So I wanted to ask you about that then, if we can dive in a little bit deeper there, then what is it that, so, your experience in the Muslim community and nonprofits, so many different, so working so long, what is the biggest lesson you've learned in working within the Muslim community? What have you seen that nonprofit leaders do? What was in all your experiences, what's been the biggest takeaway for you in terms of leadership in nonprofits?
To be honest, there are so many takeaways. But if I were to classify the two things that stand out the most from my experience, is, the first would be resourcefulness, right? And in particular, when organizations struggle, they may not necessarily have all the human resources or financial resources in place, to accomplish a particular goal or to achieve a mission or to accomplish a project or what have you. What I noticed in nonprofits is that leaders tend to be, in general, a lot more resourceful. They're able to think outside the box. They're able to utilize whatever little financial or human resources possible in order to accomplish their goals. So that's the first thing that I noticed, because it's different from one context to another, one industry to another, one sector to another. Some industries or sectors, they might have all the financial resources in place, and they might have the luxury of hiring new staff and so on and so forth. They're building their capacity, yet they might struggle to accomplish their goals, or they might struggle to get to their mission or their project, and the list goes on and on. And yeah, there could be many variables to that, but in many cases, it's the lack of being resourceful as individuals, even when everything has been essentially offered to them. Versus in many nonprofits, they face so many challenges in resources in general, yet they're able to accomplish their goals because of their mindset of capitalizing on whatever little that they have. So that's the first maybe takeaway that I noticed. And then the second takeaway, which may not be necessarily as positive as the first one, is the stagnation that I noticed in many nonprofits, right? And in this particular case, what that means is you notice that there is repetition of similar strategies, similar tactics, similar programs, similar offerings, similar approaches, similar frameworks, and the list goes on to doing the work that they do. That's the general default, if it makes sense, in nonprofits. The exception is when you see an organization that actually tries out of its way, in a way, to be extremely innovative and to constantly challenge itself to produce new programs, new initiatives, and so on and so forth. So that's my second takeaway. I think in the first one was positive for many nonprofit leaders and negative in general to other sectors. The second one is the opposite, maybe more negative to nonprofits and more positive to other sectors because of that pressure to having to be much more innovative and having to maintain and refresh to a certain extent a lot of their offerings and approaches and so on and so forth. I don't have data to back up both of my takeaways. I don't have scientific data or any quantitative data. These are just anecdotes that I'm sharing based on the question that you have.
No, and I mean, I really appreciate that, and I think you hit it on the head. I mean, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of data. We need a lot more data and research in terms of particularly nonprofits in our community and how they gauge their their innovation, their creativity, as you talked about. And but I love that. So one piece was very focused on the resourcefulness of leaders, because truly you're always you have to turn lemons into lemonade all the time in nonprofit work, and that's a reality wherever you go. Many different organizations, but I love the idea of the stagnation is a lack of change, lack of innovation and creativity, as you mentioned. But I definitely agree with you on both, and I think that both are very vital, and they're great takeaways. And it's your mashallah, a lot of experience. So alhamdulillah, we love that insight. What is so I want, I guess this piece will lead us into I think very vital for a lot of the leaders that listen to this podcast. Our target audience are again nonprofit leaders in various organizations. So what is it that, so if we can solve some of those challenges that you just alluded to, what is everybody, so first and foremost to you, how has the landscape shifted? And what does that mean for the future of nonprofit work, given the reality of COVID, the pandemic, the virtual world? In your opinion, how have you seen the landscape shift? Let's say at a high level in nonprofits, what have you seen in terms of how things have shifted, and maybe how they'll continue for the rest of this year, and maybe into the foreseeable future?
Sure. I mean, that's a very good question and a very complex one to unpack. So Jazakallah khair for it, Akhi Rami. And there are lots of things, and I'm just going to share raw, unfiltered in a way, thoughts that I have that may not be as structured, right? But I think hopefully there'll be some sort of insights, and feel free to stop me at any point. Mm-hmm. There are reports that may not apply to many Muslim organizations, specifically for nonprofits, that came out in the past few months, and the impact on their budgeting, on their staffing, and so on and so forth. And some numbers are shocking, and we can share with people if you wish. The listeners that are interested, they can contact you, and I'll share with you some of the reports for those that are interested. Perhaps they fall in those categories, and perhaps they don't. Mm-hmm. But regardless, there's definitely major, especially financial impact on so many nonprofits due to grants, due to grants not necessarily being afforded in the same fashion, due to foundations reducing their budgets for nonprofits, due to donors, whether it's the high value donors or others that are much more conservative and much more selective in their organizations, and especially during the COVID crisis, they could have been perhaps prior to it donating to so many organizations, nonprofit organizations, but some of them again became more conservative and then became also more selective because they want to impact people that are directly impacted by COVID, whether it's those that are struggling from a health standpoint, or they lost their jobs and they need financial support, and so on and so forth. So that there are major impacts, and we can share the reports. And I foresee more reports to come out that with numbers changing in that direction in the next few months, depending on the time people are listening to this podcast. So that's definitely an impact, from COVID in particular. The other part is that you definitely see an effort from some organizations. Remember that the second point we talked about earlier, that stagnation, right? Perhaps COVID pushed some organizations to start to shift and to start to try and become more innovative. But I don't want to be a pessimist here, but I want to be clear, because we tend to have an illusion that just because, I was teaching classes, let's assume in-person classes in my nonprofit organization. Now, because of COVID, I'm teaching online classes. Let's assume that's a typical organization. Mm-hmm. That doesn't necessarily mean that the organization has shifted to disrupt itself beyond stagnation. I think that's so critical. Just simply shifting your classroom from an in-person to online does not mean that you've disrupted yourself and adapted enough. In many cases, look, the reports that are currently available, some organizations have already shut down. Some nonprofit organizations have already shut down, and some organizations project for themselves that they only have available resources. Even though they tend to be resourceful, they only have available resources for the next few months, and unless they're able to be supported by government grants and so on and so forth, they are at risk of shutting down. And therefore, simply turning an in-person classroom into an online classroom isn't enough of an adaptation. It requires, in many cases, a complete makeover. And maybe the distinction to make is the distinction between like a revolutionary transformational change versus an evolutionary transactional change. And I'm not saying it for the sake of buzzwords, but that's the idea. It requires like a revolutionary change, a transformational change in policies, in salaries, in programs, to the deepest level versus an evolutionary transactional, and that is, hey, we were doing it once again, an in-person class setting or classroom setting now to just using Zoom or whatever online platform. That isn't enough for a lot of organizations. Similarly, we were doing a fundraiser gala in person at that hotel or that location or that banquet hall, and now we're just simply doing it on Facebook or Zoom or whatever other platforms. That is not enough of an adaptation and a disruption, especially in times of crisis that we're in order to, I'm going to say this, in order to survive, let alone thrive, for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're bringing up great points. I mean, I love the points that, that just shifting things doesn't actually mean it's innovative, right? It's just the shift. So you focus on this point a lot. So I would like for you to dive in now, if you don't mind. Then how the reality is, though, a lot of these organizations, as you mentioned, they're in survival mode, right? Leaders are in survival mode. They're thinking about just how to keep things functioning, how to keep the community center operating, the masjid operating, the national organization operating, right? Even though I think some are absolutely thriving, some are doing much better because they've been able to make some adjustments, but a lot are not. So Mohammed, because you mentioned the point that it's better now to make those transformational changes. But if there's just so much fear around and you're just in survival mode, how do you make those changes? What changes should be made and how should they be made if you think about transforming your nonprofit in the world today? What would your advice be there?
Sure, Akhi. And again, another complex question that requires unwrapping, right?
We can go for a couple hours. No problem.
I have the tendency, as you know, to sometimes go on and on. So feel free to jump in. And thanks, Akhi. And so when I think of it, the idea is to be able, for sure, number one, process the emotion. You're saying, they're in survival mode. As the leader of a nonprofit, you have to process the emotion and help others process their emotion.
Right.
That's understandable, but you have to go beyond that then, right? And that is to start to think of clearly what are the so-called non-negotiables that we're not going to change whatsoever because they're considered our guide. And those they tend to be very few: our vision, our mission, our values.
Right.
In fact, we need to anchor more on them as principles in times of crisis like this more than ever, because
Absolutely.
They help us, they guide us to make the right decisions. But those are the non-negotiables that in many cases we don't need to touch or change or modify, but rather, once again, anchor on them to help us make the right decisions. Because some people, when they're not anchored on them, in fact, they become the worst in times of crisis. And, they automatically start to violate their own values and so on and so forth, just because of looking at the bottom line. at the expense of firing everyone, at the expense of whatever it is, without looking at first their values and utilizing that as their guide. But nonetheless, number one, once again, to process the emotion and to help others process the emotion. Number two, to start to look at the non-negotiables as guides to make decisions moving forward. And then number three, to look at everything else. And I'm going to say here, I know it's different from one organization to another. And I know you have listeners that have different sizes and different scopes of organizations and capacities. I understand that. But my challenge is to challenge yourselves to actually look at everything else as negotiable and open to change. And I'm talking about everything else that's done. And I know it's so difficult when our DNA has been, we have to do X, Y, and Z like X, Y, and Z. We have to do the programs in this way. We have to do this in this way. We have to pay people in this way. But to actually think and say everything else is negotiable, almost as if we're starting from scratch. Yes, our organization has been there for 10 years, 15 years, 5 years, 20 years, but we will think of this as if we're starting from scratch. 2021 is a brand new organization, and all we have is our mission, our vision, our values, and we have to now strategize and plan for 2021 at least as a starting point to plan for it with everything else negotiable, meaning how do we envision brand new programs with the current normal that we're living in, the dynamics that we're living in, not with the mindset and the sight of 2020 or 2019 and so on and so forth. Looking at it with 2021 in mind, right? How do we offer our programs? How do we offer our services? What services in particular? What target demographics in particular? What business model do we approach? What marketing tactics and strategies do we employ? And the list goes on, as if it's starting from scratch. And I think that's a challenge for sure. It's not easy, but it must be done. It must be done to try and stretch our mindset as leaders to actually shift faster, to pivot faster. What I've seen in 2020, unfortunately, and again, I don't mean to be a pessimist, and I don't have data to back it up, even though some data exists in reports about the bankruptcies and about a number of organizations shutting down, right? And we have some examples that we know on a personal level. But regardless, what I observed is the fact that there is lack of pivoting fast from organizations. And because we're still stuck in the old mindset, we're going to go back to the old normal at one point or another, as opposed to challenging ourselves. And yes, it's difficult. It's not easy to say, you know what, we're almost starting from scratch. How do we approach this new normal? How do we embrace it? That's our new reality. Let's not talk about the old realities. This is now our new reality for 2021. How do we approach it in a brand new way? And what's shocking, and I'll stop here, because as I mentioned to you, I have a tendency to go on and on. What's shocking, what I observed, again, I don't have data to back it up, is that I see large corporations that I've had the pleasure to work with, like Microsoft and Chase and so many others. Large, you're talking about global organizations, and yes, you could say they have resources, but I see them being a lot more nimble and a lot better and faster in pivoting than small-sized nonprofit organizations, which is for me very shocking. Once again, I don't have data to back it up. It's just an observation. Usually, it's the opposite. Usually, a small organization, especially a nonprofit organization, is supposed to pivot better and faster than a large global organization that has sometimes 100,000 plus employees and hundreds of millions of stakeholders and clients and so on and so forth. And what's shocking is what I observed is, as I said, large organizations literally disrupting themselves and pivoting so much faster. And a part of it is what I mentioned, is the fact that they've embraced the new normal in many cases, and they wanted to really work fast in modifying and changing what they do as as much as possible and as fast as possible to be able to thrive and leverage this crisis as an opportunity, not necessarily as time for reduction or time for loss, and the list goes on and on.
No, I love it. I think I love your points. You're hitting the nail on the head. This concept. I mean, look, the leadership is first and foremost the idea of starting from scratch. So that's kind of scary for a lot of people that have been in organizations for a long time, right? That you need to reinvent and reimagine yourself in a way that maybe you're not a founder of that organization, you weren't initially around. Maybe the mission and vision is kind of clear, but you don't know if you can anchor to it. It's really interesting that you mentioned that. So I want to, you mentioned some amazing points about the need to be agile, about the need to rethink things, about the need to have anchors and pillars that guide the organization. How are leaders supposed to do this? So if we were sitting in a meeting and you were talking to a bunch of leaders of nonprofits, what steps do they need to take? Like, is there an order of steps that they should be taking? How, like, should they just be stopping all their services and programs and maybe the redundant things that they're doing and just take, I don't know, a month, 2 months and just plan this out? You know, a lot of them are volunteers. A lot of them are not. Maybe, as you know, maybe there's some staff. Maybe even they're fully staffed, but they're just too busy executing on, you know, day-to-day things. What's the process for this? How would you advise nonprofit leaders to take the steps to do the things that you were just talking about, rethinking themselves, reimagining, and re-strategizing, if you will?
Sure. No, absolutely. Look, it's not as complex as it sounds, to be honest with you. Just organizations like your organization that offers a clear service, whether it's a one-day virtual strategic and operational planning for nonprofit leaders or a weekend training. It does not require a lot of time, and it should be the highest level of priority and urgency. They don't have to necessarily stop all of their current programs and services because sometimes it's generating revenue and they have to pay staff, and it's understandable, but at least they can run simultaneously, run a weekend retreat like similarly with what you're offering as an organization to nonprofit leaders. Run that, make sure it's a priority, it's the highest level of urgency, and then be able within that training, whether it's 1 day or 2 days back to back, be able to come up with your operational plan for 2021 and your strategic plan for 2025. Even in times of crisis, you have to think of short term and you have to think of long term, and be able, as you know, with the services that you're offering, you know, you'll walk the nonprofit leaders through clear steps to articulate their focus, to articulate their direction moving forward, to articulate their decisions moving forward, short-term and long-term, to articulate their KPIs, their key performance indicators for the short-term and the long-term, to articulate the tough decisions that they have to make in both best-case scenario and worst-case scenario of the duration of those plans, both the 2021 short-term plan as well as the strategic long-term plan. So that articulation happens within those trainings. So my recommendation to any nonprofits, make that the highest level of priority. Dedicate a day or a weekend, get this service, you know, book the workshop, and make sure that you're going through that, and that you dedicate the time and the effort to do that, so that you hopefully make the right shift in the right direction for 2021 and beyond that, inshallah.
So you're saying intentionally, whether you're getting an organization like Oak Tree Institute to help you, or whether a lot of organizations, they do this themselves. Of course, we help and support the process, and we kind of outline some of the steps, but nonetheless, they should dedicate a good amount of time. It's the beginning of the year, obviously, and it's planning season, but you're going a little bit deeper than just a simple operational plan, right? Where things are just going to be done the way they've been done all the time. You're really thinking about realigning if you're a community center, if you're a masjid, how are you thinking about programs differently? If you're a service-based organization, or you're a relief, some kind of relief or service organization, you want them to think, because you want them to think more. How do they think more innovatively though, right? Is it just simply as getting a training for them to think more out of the box, to be more creative, if you will?
So I guess there are multiple, again, layers also to your question here. So the first portion is related to almost like the internal change agent versus external change agent, right? Do they do it themselves versus do they hire an organization like yours to offer them the training and the coaching and the consulting? And then the second layer is related to the innovation, how they can think differently. I think there are relationships between the two. My recommendation is to get an external organization like yourself and perhaps others to be able to help. Why I'm saying this? Even if the organization already has the capacity and the competency of planning, I still recommend an external change agent to help them facilitate that planning, even if they have the skill set. Why? Because the idea is, especially in times of crisis, most likely they will still operate within similar mindsets, right? And they will still operate, as we know, there's groupthink or that phenomenon that exists. Even if some of them wants to shift, a lot of people will conform to what that influential board president or whatever says, and it's not necessarily, in many cases, going to be disruptive enough. So having an external change agent that helps them, a trainer, a consultant, will provide that external perspective and then will push them to the edge to a certain extent to be able, again, to challenge themselves to think in a very disruptive manner as opposed to continuing to conform and operate within a similar mindset as everyone else within that organization. So that's my natural tendency. Even once again, as I said, even if they have the capacity of planning on their own, they know the skill sets, they've done it for years, I still recommend getting an external change agent, a trainer or a coach to do so, let alone if the organization doesn't have that competency, meaning they don't have a board president or someone within the organization that actually knows how to strategize and plan for an operational plan and a strategic plan. Now, it ties to your second point, I guess, with innovation as well, right? Thinking in an innovative manner. There's something, as you know, scenario planning, and I touched upon it, very briefly. With scenario planning, you're supposed to look at all the possible scenarios, even if you don't like them, and hopefully come up with innovative solutions and in a proactive manner, come up with innovative approaches to handling those scenarios. So in that one day or that one weekend of planning, you look at, let's assume, best case scenario based on the data that exists from the CDC and government agencies and so on and so forth. Based on that, best case scenario is that Ramadan will be basically available for people within a much higher capacity. People will be vaccinated and whatever, X, Y, and Z. Let's assume you come up with the best case scenario and you detail everything that relates to the best case scenario, once again, for the short term and for the long term. For the operational plan, that's 2021, and for the strategic plan, that's 2025. So the best case scenario with everything, with what it looks like in detail, based on projections, based on studying some of the reports, based on analysis of some of the experts, based on recommendations of various different credible organizations, you list the outcome of that, as well as how your organization will be in that best case scenario. What programs will it offer? How many staff members? How will they work? The financial model, and the list goes on and on. Then you look at also worst case scenario. Worst case scenario. And that is absolutely, with everything that it entails, that still, even if, let's assume right now, there is a 25% capacity limit for nonprofits. Let's assume within maintaining 6 feet distance and masks and sanitizing and all of that. Let's assume there's even a worse case scenario than that, and that is a complete shutdown to take place in the short term as well as in the long term again. Complete shutdown in which you're not even able to open up the doors. You have to detail what the worst case scenario would look like, even if it means saying we only have $1,000 in our bank account and we have to figure out a way to pay 5 full-time employees, right? It's like you have to detail it in particular and be very, very explicit in what it looks like as the worst case scenario, and what actions are you going to take, how your organization will look like, what programs will you offer, what staffing would look like, and the list goes on and on, right? And as I said, what helps with that is having a trainer, an external trainer. Alhamdulillah, your organization is offering the programs and the trainings, and organizations need to capitalize on external change agents so that they can help them think in an innovative manner. Of course, you can develop the capacity to be innovative, just like you can develop the capacity and the competency to plan and to have that skill set. You can do the same thing for innovation and creativity. But once again, an external change agent, especially because of the urgency of this. This is not just, let's now develop that skill set and let's spend the next 6 months to train a board on how to become more innovative. Right. It's about, once again, it's about pivoting and pivoting fast. There's no more time for a lot of organizations to just continue to operate almost as normal or with simple shifts from being in person to online. That's not enough, as I stated, and it requires fast, almost immediate action that a change, an external change agent or a trainer or a consultant can help them with, so that they can move very, very quickly in 2021, inshallah.
I love that. So first and foremost, I think you hit the nail on the head with all those and strategies and tips. What's very interesting, and I know you know this, and we felt this as well, is that unfortunately, one of the things that these nonprofits are not doing is spending money on training right now. I think they see that as, whether it's training or consulting or support or external work, they're seeing that as a thing that they can't afford right now, or they don't have the time for, right? Whereas I think the way you outline it is amazing, is that first and foremost, it gives you a change agent. I love that. Like, it's an external change agent that forces you to think differently, to have a process in place, to strategize in a different way. Yeah, at the same time, there's different strategies in doing it, right? Whether it's best case, worst case scenarios, or thinking about how to understand your audiences better, how to understand who you're serving better, right? There's so much there, and a lot of times, unfortunately, that's organizations just need to invest that, and I love that you emphasize on that. And I know our time is crunching. We're quickly winding down in the interview. It's just been full of gems and full of wonderful insights, and we ask Allah to bless you, Akhi Muhammad.
Adam, if I might interrupt you here, Akhi,
sure, go ahead.
Since you brought up that point, and I think it's of the utmost importance in this case. Now more than ever, training and development has always been at the highest level of importance, technically speaking, even though unfortunately, realistically speaking, it hasn't been in many nonprofits.
Yes.
But what I'm going to say, and I know it might sound like too much to some people, but I mean every word that I say in this particular case. Now more than ever, in times of crisis, especially in times of crisis, getting training is not complimentary. It's not a luxury. It is a necessity now more than ever. So I highly, not just recommend, I urge every organization out there, even if you have a tight budget, in many cases, your investment in that training has a return on investment. In many cases, and I'm not guaranteeing anything, but in many cases, it could be even a much bigger financial return on investment, not just a return on investment in non-tangible ways, but even financially. So I highly urge, not just recommend, urge leaders, especially of nonprofit organizations, to prioritize that and to make that of the utmost importance now more than ever, because as I said, it's a necessity. You need to shift, you need to disrupt, you need to move, you need to pivot, or else, sadly, and I hate to say it or see it, when it does happen, when we look back, if Allah gives us the opportunity, at the end of 2021, when we look back and we realize the organizations at the end of 2021 that we used to go to, that we used to enjoy, that we used to benefit from, that existed in the beginning of 2021 are no longer there. And I'm not trying to scare anyone, but that is the reality that we have to come to terms with. And unless and only when we begin to prioritize training and development to help us shift faster, to shift our structures, to shift our staffing, to shift our policies, to shift our procedures, to shift our fundraising models, to shift everything that we do fast, that will be the unfortunate reality that we might have to live with at the end of the year. And I hope that it never comes.
Allah barak fikum. That was I was going to ask you to kind of summarize your takeaway points, but I think that beautifully did it. That now more than ever, it is essential to not just. I think it's not just about getting training, it's not an event, but to invest in it, right? To be dedicated to getting the best practices, getting the best insight, getting the best feedback, getting the best advice, getting the best consulting. It is so crucial now more than ever. And just like you said, yeah, it is not just organizations that, people are thinking very short-sighted. It's not just about the survival of your organization for this month or this year. It is about just the long-term, where will you be as an institution or organization for the foreseeable future? And I love the way you did that. And again, Jazakallah khair, Akhi Mohammed, beautiful insights, so many amazing points and tremendous reflections and so many lessons. I definitely hope that all nonprofit leaders will listen to this, understand how this should set their trajectory for the year, for the future, and hopefully benefit from it. I want to take a minute and Mohammed, to just, where can people connect with you? I know you have so much advice and you have so much insights, and how can people connect with you? What projects are you working on? How can people be attuned to the work that you're doing and be there to kind of engage with you and your content and your work?
Sure, Jazakallah khair. I guess there are two ways when it comes to consulting. They can reach me. The best is not social media. It could be the email info@almathil.com. And then we also have an organization that's dedicated to developing youth leaders. It's called Youth Laboratory, and we're an online platform. We offer online courses, and alhamdulillah, perhaps, thankfully, but regardless, we were online before COVID even started. We launched our organization before anyone, heard of a pandemic. So we've been offering online courses in various leadership skill sets, from crisis management to team management to time management and many others. So anyone that's interested, inshallah, can join us, and they can get access to our courses instantly and immediately, or they can reach me via email there as well, almathil@youthlaboratory.com.
Jazakallah khairan, barakallahu feekum. Definitely encourage everybody to please connect with Mohammed Almathil. Give him an email. Definitely check out Youth Laboratories, the website. Their work, some amazing trainings, and as he mentioned, some amazing ways to invest in yourself and your organizations and the things that you're doing. Really, really appreciate it, Akhi Mohammed. I know that I've learned so much from you, and you've been a wonderful mentor and teacher, but of course a very, very good friend. So very happy to have had you on, and Jazakallah khair for the tremendous feedback and insights. And inshallah ta'ala, we hope that we can put it into practice. And I think that's more than anything, is that we need leaders to seek and gain beneficial information and knowledge, but put it into practice. And we hope that Allah allows us to do that, all of us. With that said, I want to thank everybody, all our listeners. Jazakallah khair for listening to this episode of the Oak Tree Institute podcast. And inshallah ta'ala, we hope and pray that you can connect with us in the very near future and connect with Akhuna Muhammad in the very near future. Barakallah feekum. Until our next episode, Jazakumullah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Oak Tree Institute podcast. Please make sure to subscribe to be notified of our new episodes each week, and please leave us a rating. We would like to invite you to join our Facebook group we have called Servant Leaders. This group is exclusively for nonprofit leaders and organizers like yourself. And it's a growing community where we post helpful articles, videos, strategies, and tips that can take you and your organization to the next level. Check the show notes below for the link and join us today. Also, if you benefited from this episode, do us a favor. Take a screenshot and post it on your social media channels and tag Oak Tree Institute. We thank you for listening, and we hope that you'll listen to our next episode.